What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. And here we are with another reaction. In this one, we got India had enough of China. Get out of Bhutan. I thought India and China had figured the little border deal out and they had come to an agreement. So I'm intrigued on what this is going to be about. Before we jump in, though, if you guys happen to enjoy, please don't forget to subscribe, give a video a thumbs up. Let's figure out what's going on.
Bhutan is under the radar, right? Wrong. This tiny Himalayan nation with just 7,500 soldiers and zero naval power is now at the heart of a dangerous standoff. China has been quietly encroaching into Bhutan, building roads and villages where it has no business. But India isn't having it. They've warned China, get out or face the consequences. Why is China so determined to grab Bhutanese land? Why is India ready to defend it with everything they've got? And how could this quiet kingdom become the spark that lights up a massive regional conflict? In this video, we dive into why Bhutan, of all places, is suddenly the hottest flashpoint between two of the world's biggest military powers. Let's start with what China is doing in Bhutan right now. It all comes down to the Bhutan-China border. Running for 296 miles, that border stretches through the Himalayas and hits two tri-points with India, one to the east and one to the west. This creates a pair of potential flashpoints for border hostilities, as we'll explore later. Bhutan also shares a border with Tibet, though this has never been officially demarcated or recognized. Historically, relations between Bhutan and China have been tense, with smatterings of diplomatic action being all that stood in the way of Beijing claiming the territory as its own. In 1930, Mao Zedong, who many see as the architect of modern China, claimed that Bhutan fell within the correct boundaries of China. When Mao's Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, took control of China, those territorial claims were built upon and maintained for several decades. By the end of the 1950s, the CCP was releasing maps showing that substantial portions of Bhutan were part of China. They weren't, at least not officially. But these constant claims, combined with the 1959 Tibetan Rebellion, made securing its borders with China a priority for Bhutan as it entered the 1960s. That rebellion was a flashpoint. Bhutan welcomed 6,000 Tibetan refugees into its territory in 1959 as China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, occupied Tibet. Fearing retaliation, Bhutan would soon after close its borders to all refugees, but the damage had been done. The PLA occupied Darchen, Gartok, and Labrang Monastery, all Bhutanese exclaves located in Tibet that Bhutan had controlled for over 3 centuries. Tensions continued to rise into the early 1960s, highlighted by the 1961 release of a Chinese map showing the country's claims over territory in Bhutan, Nepal, and the Kingdom of Sikkim. Incursions into Bhutan became increasingly common, with Bhutan responding by enforcing a cross-border trade embargo, while building military ties with the only nation it believed could prevent the CCP from overrunning its territory, India. These ties would prove vital for India when the Sino-Indian War broke out in 1962, as Indian troops were allowed to move through Bhutan to attack via its border with China. But it wasn't enough. India lost the war, raising questions over its ability to protect Bhutan in the future. That Indian defeat marked a switch in policy for Bhutan, as it adopted neutrality over relying on any military to protect its territory. Bhutan's king also officially recognized 4 disputed regions in Bhutanese territory. Portions of Doklam, Amochu, Sinchela, and the mountain ridges stretching between Gamochen and Batangla were all being claimed both by Bhutan and China. The next few decades were highlighted.
I feel like China just be knowing they ain't got no claim to the land. Knowing it's not your territory. Just be making these maps to say this is our territory, it belongs to us, and then they think because they made these maps that say this is their territory, that it actually do belong to them, which is absolutely wild. You can't just say this is mine because I wrote it as mine on a map.
By more diplomatic wrangling between Bhutan and China. The latter never militarily invaded the former. Instead, it relied on a combination of pressure and subtle infrastructure developments to stake its claims. In the 1980s, Bhutan willingly relinquished its claim to a 154 square mile portion of land named Kulakari on its northern border. By 1984, Bhutan and China had agreed to take part in annual talks related to its border disputes with the goal of resolving them once and for all. Given that we're talking about these disputes 30 years later, you can already imagine how conclusive those annual meetings have been. As we entered the
Not very.
1990s,
Not very.
Bhutan and China agreed to a handful of land exchanges and signed a bilateral agreement to maintain peace along the contested borders in 1998. China quickly violated that agreement as it started building roads on territory Bhutan believed it owned. Though the two countries eventually signed an interim agreement over this disputed land tract, the incident showcased the new tactic China would use to gain territory it thinks it owns in Bhutan. Outwardly, it recognizes Bhutanese sovereignty and claims to be trying to settle its disputes with the country diplomatically, but behind the scenes, China starts invading not by force, but by building infrastructure, so it can apply pressure that forces Bhutan to slowly but surely give up portions of its territory. It's a smart strategy, and it's one that China has employed successfully for over 20 years, which brings us to 2023 and the Chinese incursions into Bhutan. In June 2023, Chatham House published a piece that discussed how China had started building several small villages in isolated mountainous regions within Bhutanese territory. These actions were nothing new. The organization said China's build first and ask questions later policy had led to it claiming up to 12% of Bhutan's territory.
We finna go, hey, I completely apologize to the people that live in them. But we know, like, there you got to draw the line and say, no, it's not happening. And just like, y'all gonna have to go back to China, but this is our territory, and we just gonna have to destroy your infrastructure. I mean, Bhutan against China, sure they wouldn't do that because, militarily they don't have the strength to do that. But yeah, China's just gonna just sneak your way in there, and because they know you don't have the strength to kick them out. At a certain point, yeah, as if they feel like they live on the land for long enough, they feel like this all land. What in the U.S., what do they call it? I can't think of the name, but why when you live in a house that's even if you don't own, somebody else owns a house, but you've been living in there for so long that it now actually belongs to you, which is like ridiculously crazy. That's what it sounds like China to be doing. Why can't I think of the name of what that's called?
Without signing any official agreements with Bhutan, incursions like this are taking place in Jakarlung, Pasamlung, and the previously mentioned contested region of Doklam, and they all seem to take the same form. First, Chinese roads start to appear in contested territory, as we saw when China violated its 1998 pact with Bhutan in the early 2000s. Those roads are followed by small buildings, allowing China to establish villages within Bhutan. Other infrastructure follows, with China typically focusing on Bhutan's uninhabited regions to ensure it faces no resistance. It's a strange yet effective approach. Rather than taking that land by force, China simply inserts its infrastructure and people, creating an argument that it owns the land out of thin air while knowing that Bhutan can't respond militarily. If it does, it angers the far more powerful Chinese military, giving the CCP a potential justification for a full-scale invasion. Instead, Bhutan has remained mostly silent about these sly incursions. All the while, China is unofficially claiming more land. The most high-profile of its incursions is the development of the village of Pangda. Home to 124 people, that new Chinese village sits a little over 1 mile into Bhutanese territory. First identified by satellite photography in October 2020, Pangda was followed by 2 more villages that follow a deep river into Bhutan and a 5.5-mile road connecting the 3. India Today also reported on these new villages, noting that Bhutan has maintained disciplined silence due to being a small country stuck between 2 giants. The outlet also speculated that China was building these villages because of upcoming...
Yeah, Bhutan can't really say much, but to have India bagging you, now that's a different story, right? We could start putting our chest out a little more because we know who we got with us. Again, for the moment, China militarily is stronger than India as well. For the moment, as India's economy continues to rise and China starts to stagnate more, and India continues to grow in their military strength, they continue. They join in that club of the top dogs when it comes to military power. And so as they continue to get stronger, we don't know, and China continues, their population continues to stagnate and continues to age. Don't know who's going to be strong after so long.
Border talks with Bhutan. It's far easier to argue that land is yours when you've built villages on it than it is to point to empty land and claim that you should own it. China's approach is all about pressure. Bhutan can argue with that, but it'll also have to do something about the several hundred villagers now living on its territory. Just hand the land over to China, the CCP could argue. China was using it, and Bhutan wasn't. China had effectively completed several land grabs, and it wouldn't stop as it headed into 2024. The United States Pacific Command, or PACOM, says that China claims around 581 square miles of territory that is internationally recognized as part of Bhutan. It hasn't built infrastructure on the vast majority of that land, but with each passing year, it seems to be trying to claim even more territory as its own. The Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary has also fallen into China's focus, with PACOM noting that China's claims seem to be geared toward pressuring Bhutan into giving up the entire Doklam Plateau. The CCP publishes legal arguments to justify every one of its land grabs, PACOM claims, though none are recognized by the wider international community. So what does any of this have to do with India? PACOM says it's all about setting up land trades. China is occupying the Bhutanese land it has now, so it can trade that land for more territory in the Doklam Plateau later during border talks. That plateau sits to Bhutan's west, almost bang on the tri-point between Bhutan, China, and India. With that land claimed, PACOM argues, China would gain a distinct military advantage over both India and Bhutan. For Bhutan, it will be sacrificing high ground standing over 14,000 feet above sea level, from which China could invade and crush the rest of the country. That's worrying enough for China, which relies on Bhutan as a buffer state. But even worse is that taking Doklam gives China easy access to roads that allow it to transfer war machinery closer to the Indian border. Tanks and armored vehicles could move through the region into India, allowing China to cut off the Siliguri Corridor, also known as the Chicken's Neck passage of land that connects India to its northeastern territory. The Chicken's Neck is around 14 miles long and connects the 7 states in India's northeast to the country's mainland. It's bordered primarily by Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, with China also sharing a small border, through which it would struggle to launch a full invasion. With Doklam, China grows its border with the Chicken's Neck substantially, giving it an easy way to enter one of India's most vulnerable regions. If China controlled the Chicken's Neck, it would essentially surround India's northeastern territories, allowing for a two-pronged attack from the west and north to take a huge chunk of India if war were to break out. India can't allow that. China wants Doklam not because of any territorial dispute with Bhutan, but because taking it essentially allows Beijing to create a small exclave that acts as a through line into India's northeast.
There you go.
India sees right through this approach. It's also found itself in conflict with China over Doklam before.
Yeah, of course China wants that, yeah. I mean, it's absolutely not about that land. Absolutely not about claiming that land in Bhutan. I think they could care less, but that land is an opportunity for them to be able to be at more of an advantage if they decide to go to war with India. And so India, like, we know y'all don't care about that land. We know exactly what you want that land for. We know it's because you want to have that advantage, but we not having that, and you not having that land. So get used to that thought. You not having it.
On June 8, 2017, China sent a platoon into Doklam. PLA soldiers destroyed several Royal Bhutan Army bunkers to clear the way for a road construction crew to start building. Again, it's China's subtle territory-snatching approach at play. Beijing knew it could destroy the bunkers without a Bhutanese response, with its goal being to build a road through which it could claim ownership of the disputed territory. The PLA cleared the way for excavators and bulldozers to arrive in Doklam, with work starting soon after. Indian troops arrived in the region 8 days later. Around 2 months of scuffles between Chinese and Indian soldiers in Doklam followed, with China claiming the Indian troops were occupying its territory, while both Bhutan and India claimed China was doing the same. In truth, it wasn't a full military scuffle. Outside of a lot of harsh words and some pushing and shoving, the scuffles didn't escalate into anything particularly dangerous. It couldn't, as neither the Chinese nor Indian troops carried weapons, in a small attempt to prevent further escalation. Instead, they engaged in regular jostling, which involves soldiers bumping chests against one another without punching or kicking. The goal is to push the other soldier back, an almost childlike display of aggression that would be funny were it not for the fact that the stakes are so high. At the peak of the conflict, around 3,000 troops from China and India were stationed in Doklam. Ultimately, the whole thing ended on August 28, 2017, when the two countries agreed to what India dubbed an expeditious disengagement of forces. China and India each declared this disengagement a victory. The entire incident was a warning sign, both to Bhutan and India. China was testing the waters in Doklam. It started building infrastructure to see what type of response it would get. In the best case, Bhutan would have remained silent, allowing the PLA to complete the work to give China a stronger claim to the land. The worst case was what we saw. Bhutan alerted India, who arrived days later, to push and shove while negotiations went on in the background.
Okay.
And he can't poop, so.
Okay.
I'll be back at some point.
Okay.
Because I'll need you to poop.
Yeah, I got you. Love you. Sorry about that. Yeah. China. Worst case scenario. Now you know when you try to push and get this territory by these methods that India is going to come to Bhutan's aid. So, by trying to take that Bhutan land, you gotta ask yourself: are you ready to go to war with India? And I don't think that's what you want. I don't think that's what you want.
It was a no-lose situation for China. Either it got the road it wanted, or it left without losing a single soldier because it knew neither India or Bhutan would escalate. In the latter case, it still got to intimidate its biggest Asian rival, letting it know that Doklam and by extension the Chicken's Neck were on the CCP radar. China learned from the 2017 Doklam incident. It hasn't tried to build on that land since, but the work it's been doing since 2023 to create villages within Bhutan is directly related to its efforts to take Doklam. The previously mentioned Panga village is essentially a bargaining chip. It's far enough away from India's border with Bhutan to make it difficult for Indian forces to enter and force China out, but it's deep enough in Bhutan to create another win-win situation. Either China keeps the villages, meaning it takes more of Bhutan and gives itself an inroad to claim more territory in the future, or China uses those villages as leverage to gain territory in Doklam so it gains a strategic advantage over India. It's all very sly, and it's all very dangerous to India. While all of this wrangling over Doklam goes on, China has also turned one eye toward the Jakarlung and Pasamlung valleys. Both lie to Bhutan's center north and don't immediately seem to offer any strategic advantage over India for China. China may view the land as a means to further exert its influence over the Himalayan region. By taking the two valleys, it provides itself with a pair of extra access points into Bhutan, allowing for further encroachment and, in the worst case, a full-blown invasion from the north. That would be worrying to India, of course, and losing Bhutan as a buffer between itself and China makes the Chicken's Neck even more vulnerable. The Carnegie Endowment offers a different interpretation of China's interests in the valleys. In 1996, China claimed about 190 square miles of territory near the Jakarlung and Pasamlung. It then entered negotiations with Bhutan, asking the tiny country to trade 103 square miles of land in Doklam for the 190 square miles in the valleys. A clever ploy. China made it look like Bhutan was getting the better end of the deal by offering more land. Of course, the valleys were
How you gonna offer somebody their own land though? Like, how you gonna take somebody's land and say, all right, we'll give you this land for that land? Like, how you gonna offer me my own land in a trade situation? That don't even make sense.
Just pawns in China's effort to gain land in Doklam to give it the strategic advantage over India we've already discussed. And it almost worked. 4 years of negotiations led to 2001, with China and Bhutan being on the brink of a land exchange. India involved itself, convincing Bhutan that ceding territory in Doklam would be bad for both countries, and the deal fell through. Now it looks like China is once again trying to claim land in the central northern valleys that it could use to trade for land in Doklam. India is being forced to pay attention as China creates pressure and tries to maneuver itself into an advantageous position, and it's doing it all without a single rifle being raised in anger. Contrast that approach to Russia, which annexed Crimea in 2014 and launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to satisfy Vladimir Putin's territorial cravings. And it's clear that China's President Xi Jinping takes a far more patient approach to building his country's influence. Where does all of this leave Bhutan? Well, right now, it's caught in the middle of a power struggle between two major global powers. Walking a dangerous tightrope, it's trying to stay neutral while recognizing the fact that China is in the midst of a power play. It can't respond militarily. Bhutan's 7,500 soldiers would be steamrolled by the PLA, which has over 2 million active members,
100%.
and access to a wealth of missiles, fighter jets, and other technology that would make fighting back a fool's errand for Bhutan. At the same time, it can't push India into a fight with China. None of the three countries want that, even with India pushing Bhutan to keep China out of its territory. The tiny nation is left trying to navigate competing interests over which it has little control. It's allied to India thanks to the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation the two countries signed in 1949, but that alliance comes with more pressure. Bhutan needs to show India that it's doing everything it can to fend off Chinese interest in its disputed territory.
Hey, they stuck in between a rock and a hard place. But I think Bhutan just continue to lean on India if the situation gets out of hand. You just got to do what you can to keep them out. But then if it gets too much for you, just continue to lean on India. Because like you said, giving up that land would be disadvantageous for India and for you, so they wouldn't just leave you guys out to dry.
All while trying to negotiate for demarcated and internationally recognized borders with a China that wants more than Bhutan and India is willing to give. Quiet diplomacy has allowed Bhutan to survive for this long. There's even a plan in place to solidify the Bhutan-China border, the three-step roadmap. Signed by the two countries in October 2021, the roadmap's 3 steps involve delimitation of the border on maps, followed by talks between the two sides, before concluding with joint surveys to determine a recognized border. India's response at the time was that it had also been holding boundary negotiations with China. Since 2021, China has only carried on building infrastructure in villages, showing that for all of its talk about agreeing to a roadmap, it's just going to carry on trying to pressure Bhutan. So Bhutan is reaching a breaking point. The 3-step roadmap hasn't brought Bhutan and China any closer to a resolution. Diplomacy is failing. And though there likely isn't an immediate threat of a Chinese invasion anytime soon, Beijing is more than happy to drag negotiations out while it quietly claims parcels of land that will give it leverage when it feels the time is right. Which brings us back to India. In November 2023, China and Bhutan held their 25th round of border talks. Newsweek suggested that these talks, perhaps more than any other, showed Bhutan trying to accelerate toward a resolution. That's worrying for India. It doesn't want China and Bhutan to get any closer to establishing normal diplomatic relations, because that would mean India risks losing some of its influence over the territory. China establishing official diplomatic ties with Bhutan will also give the CCP a major feather for its cap. It will be able to show the world that it can resolve disputes through diplomacy rather than its superior military. Of course, this public messaging would conveniently ignore the sly infrastructure building tactics that China can only pull off because the PLA is so much stronger than Bhutan's army. China has already started that messaging. In a piece for China's state-run newspaper China Daily, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences researcher Sun Jiwei claimed that India is doing exactly what it claims China is trying to do to Bhutan. India's control over Bhutan's security and economic lifeline allows it to interfere in its internal and external affairs, Sun wrote, while claiming that India's influence over Bhutan is hegemonic. In other words, India treats Bhutan as a little brother, while exerting what amounts to a ruling influence over the small country. China may have a case. India is just as willing to use Bhutan to establish its influence as China, but China simultaneously pushing for normalized diplomatic relations with Bhutan while playing its territorial game is something that India may have to accept, as Bhutan.
I'm sorry to say, China pretty. India ain't having it, but China is pretty smart how they operate and how they do things, and that patience that they have is a killer. So, like I said, India ain't having it, but China's no dummy.
Bhutan is looking for a way to guarantee its own security. After all, it turned to India as a defender in the 1960s, only to see the PLA overcome the Indian military. What would happen to Bhutan if a similar conflict broke out in 2024 and the country didn't have Chinese-recognized borders? The uncertain answer to that question is what forces Bhutan to walk the diplomatic tightrope. India is trying to counteract the growing Chinese influence in Bhutan by reaffirming itself as the small nation's main partner. It's investing in Bhutan's hydro sector and provides the country with access to Bangladeshi ports for trading. India is being even more subtle than China in its attempts to influence the tiny nation, with its messaging revolving around a neighborhood-first approach, when its altruism is as much strategic as it is an effort to help Bhutan strengthen itself. Constantino Xavier of the Center for Social and Economic Progress says India is trying to build economic interdependence as a geostrategic tool to preempt China. We're seeing the same sort of tit-for-tat game that plays out on the borders India shares with China, only now they involve an entire country. Each wants to protect its interests, with Bhutan perhaps being the unwilling beneficiary of altruism that's designed to push it toward choosing one side or the other. The result is simply more tension, as Bhutan tries to remain neutral. India is still ahead of China when it comes to this game of influencing Bhutan. Beyond establishing socio-economic dependence, India is also heavily involved in training Bhutan's meager military. The Indian military training team celebrated its 61st Raising Day in Bhutan in October 2023, marking over 6 decades of this military cooperation, with the diplomat even going as far to call Bhutan India's first line of defense against China back in 2014. So India's influence runs strong in Bhutan. The question now is whether China's tactic of trying to force Bhutan's hand into giving up the land it wants while wearing an outward face of diplomacy will be enough to subvert that influence. It all comes down to Bhutan's response to China's pressure. What happens if Bhutan caves? The potential answers are speculative, but it risks turning itself into an enemy of India, especially if it gives up Doklam and exposes India's chicken neck. Bhutan runs the risk of incurring India's wrath, something it absolutely doesn't want to do given its tiny military. Its other option is to join up with India to offer a more militaristic response to China's ambitions. That would force the tiny nation to forego its policies of neutrality and silent diplomacy, making it an enemy of Beijing in the process. Ultimately, Bhutan would have little military influence either way. It will be relying on whichever country with which it aligns to protect it against the other, which brings us to a final question. Who would win if India and China went to war over Bhutan? The two countries are fairly evenly matched, with global firepower ranking China third and India fourth in its annual list of 145 most powerful military nations. India has the pure manpower advantage, its active military is smaller, with 1.455 million members versus China's 2.035 million. But India has 645,000 more reserve personnel and paramilitary forces that number over 2.5 million that it could call upon to bolster its official military if war came. In every other area, China comes out on top. Beijing's annual military budget is over $150 billion higher than India's, and it's putting that extra money to good use. China has over 1,000 more aerial assets than India, including double the number of fighter jets. It also has more tanks, armored vehicles, and self-propelled artillery, making it more mobile in a ground conflict. And with 730 naval assets versus India's 294, including over 40 more submarines, and a much stronger fleet of destroyers, China would likely win any battle held at sea. India's approach would likely be to reinforce its borders and rely on superior manpower to hold China off. Bhutan would become a battlefield, with India doing all it can to prevent China from reaching Doklam so the chicken neck remains safe. Of course, both would have to deal with the adverse terrain of the Himalayan mountains, which could limit either in terms of the number of ground troops they can deploy into opposing territory. It's a difficult one to call. All that's certain is that Bhutan could be the catalyst for the boiling over of border-related tensions that have existed for decades. The tightrope the tiny nation walks gets thinner by the day, and it may only be a matter of time before it falls and inadvertently plunges itself into a war between two far more powerful nations. But what do you think about the situation in Bhutan? Will China's approach of snatching up land for future trades eventually see it land Doklam? Is India going to become more aggressive in its attempt to defend Bhutan's sovereignty as much for its own sake as that of the tiny kingdom? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Spain Has Had Enough of...
I think if they went to war 1-to-1, China would end up winning due to, like you said, just more of a defense budget, better weaponry, more weaponry. But in the Himalayas, I think India has that advantage in the Himalayas. But also what I really think is the fact that India has a lot of strategic partnerships with countries. India's made friends with a lot of countries, while I don't think China has that many partnerships with other countries. And so I feel like there would be other countries that would come to India's aid. One being because of the strategic partnerships, and two being because they're also enemies of China. And so in doing that, I think other countries would come to India's aid. And like you've seen in the Ukraine, where people are giving so much weaponry and everything, I think if not manpower, they definitely be willing to give weaponry and everything for India to defeat China. Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so that's where I think China would lose, just due to the partnerships that India has with other countries in the world and the relationships they have. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear it in the comment section. Do you guys ever think they'll get Doklam, or do you guys think India will defend it to the last man? That's all we got. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the next one. I'll see y'all next time.